Miss Marple, and the Regatta Riddle. Welcome to Mindful Musings. I'm your host, William, and I'm truly grateful you've joined us today. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something wonderful about knowing our little community spans the globe. Now, settle in with something warm to drink, find your most comfortable spot, and let's step into the world of Miss Marple together. Chapter 1. A Summer Sunday and the Lady Margaret's Final Voyage. The July sun hung high over the River Thames, casting diamonds of light across the water as the village of Lower Mead prepared for its most anticipated event of the summer season. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her wide-brimmed straw hat and smiled at the festive scene unfolding along the riverbank. Bunting in cheerful reds, whites and blues fluttered from every lamppost and tree, while the smell of strawberries and cream drifted from the refreshment tents that dotted the lawn of the Lower Mead Boat Club. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a floral dress that somehow managed to clash magnificently with every colour in nature, fanned herself vigorously with her programme. "Jane, my dear, I'm so pleased you agreed to come. The regatta is always such a delightful affair. Do look at that magnificent steam launch over there, the one with the brass fittings absolutely gleaming." Miss Marple's keen blue eyes followed her friend's gesture to where the Lady Margaret sat moored at the prime position on the dock. The vessel was indeed magnificent, a perfectly restored 1890 steam launch that drew admiring glances from everyone who passed. Her varnished mahogany hull glowed like honey in the sunlight, and her brass funnel and fittings had been polished to mirror brightness. "She's quite beautiful," Miss Marple agreed. "Rather like stepping back 70 years, isn't it? I understand her owner, Mr. Ashford, spent 5 years on the restoration." "Geoffrey Ashford? Yes. Lovely man, terribly enthusiastic about maritime history." Mrs. Bantry consulted her programme. "It says here he's almost certain to win the best restored vessel competition." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her attention caught by a man standing beside the Lady Margaret, gesturing animatedly to a small crowd of admirers. Geoffrey Ashford was a tall, distinguished-looking gentleman in his late 50s, dressed appropriately for the occasion in white flannel trousers and a striped blazer. Standing slightly apart from the group was another man, shorter and stockier, with greying hair and a distinctly less enthusiastic expression. Miss Marple observed him with the quiet attention she habitually applied to human behaviour. "That's Thomas Wright, Ashford's business partner," Mrs. Bantry supplied, following Miss Marple's gaze. "They run a marine restoration business together. Though I must say, Mr. Wright doesn't look as pleased about the Lady Margaret's prospects as one might expect." The afternoon proceeded with pleasant anticipation as the crowd gathered for the vintage steam launch parade. At precisely 2:45, Geoffrey Ashford stood at the helm of the Lady Margaret, ready for his moment of triumph. Miss Marple watched from her bench on the riverbank, noting the pride on his face. What happened next would haunt the pleasant summer afternoon for years to come. As Ashford reached for the throttle to engage the engine, the Lady Margaret's boiler exploded with a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very air. The brass funnel flew upward, steam erupted in a scalding white cloud, and the beautiful mahogany hull shuddered violently as the force of the explosion tore through the vessel's heart. Chapter 2. The Impossible Accident and a Certificate's Curious Signature. The screaming started almost immediately, a chorus of shock and horror that drowned out the dying hiss of escaping steam. Miss Marple rose from her bench with remarkable speed for someone of her years, her hand reaching instinctively for Mrs. Bantry's arm as her friend made to rush toward the dock. The Lady Margaret was listing badly, her stern already beginning to sink as water poured through the ruptured hull. Geoffrey Ashford's body lay crumpled on what remained of the deck, clearly beyond any earthly help. "Stay here, Dolly," Miss Marple said firmly, though her voice was gentle. "There will be quite enough confusion without adding to it." Indeed, the regatta's medical team was already racing toward the dock, though it was tragically obvious that their skills would be of no use to Geoffrey Ashford. Miss Marple's keen eyes swept the scene with the methodical attention she had cultivated over decades of observing human nature. What immediately struck her as peculiar was not the explosion itself, horrific though it was, but the reactions of those around her. Thomas Wright stood frozen at the judge's platform, his face pale but his expression oddly blank, as though he was processing something he had expected, but found nevertheless overwhelming. There was no frantic rush toward his partner's body, no cries of anguish, just a strange stillness that seemed at odds with the chaos erupting around him. "How dreadful," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her face ashen. "Poor Mr. Ashford. But Jane, how could this happen? Surely a steam boiler doesn't just explode like that." "Quite right, dear," Miss Marple murmured, her attention now focused on several men who were clearly familiar with steam launches, gathered in an urgent consultation near the dock. Their gestures and expressions suggested confusion and disbelief, rather than simple shock. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived some 20 minutes later, Miss Marple had positioned herself close enough to the damaged vessel to observe several significant details. The Lady Margaret had been secured with ropes and was no longer sinking, though she sat low in the water, with her deck at a dangerous angle. "Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock said with a combination of respect and resignation as he spotted her near the cordon. "I might have known you would be present at another suspicious death." "Hardly suspicious, Inspector," she replied mildly, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "Though, I confess, I find certain aspects of this tragedy rather puzzling. Steam boiler explosions in well-maintained vessels are extraordinarily rare, are they not?" "What makes you say the vessel was well-maintained?" the inspector asked. "Mr. Ashford displayed his safety inspection certificate rather prominently on the dock this morning. I happened to examine it while admiring the Lady Margaret before the parade." Miss Marple paused, her hands folded peacefully over her handbag. "It was dated just 1 week ago, and certified the boiler as being in perfect working order." Inspector Craddock made a note in his book. "Could you describe this certificate, Miss Marple?" It was mounted in a small brass frame on a stand near the vessel's mooring. Rather official-looking, with what appeared to be the signature of a certified marine engineer at the bottom, though, I must say, there was something about that signature that caught my attention at the time. "What sort of something?" Miss Marple considered her words carefully. It had that particular hesitancy one sees in signatures that aren't quite natural. When someone signs a name that isn't their own, there's often a slight tremor or unevenness to the hand. "You're suggesting the certificate was forged?" "I'm suggesting that the signature appeared inconsistent with what one would expect from a professional signing documents regularly." Chapter 3. The business partner's bad back and a convenient excuse. The evening brought cooler air and the subdued atmosphere of a community in shock. The regatta had been cancelled immediately after the explosion, with competitors and spectators dispersing in sombre groups. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry had remained at the boat club at Inspector Craddock's request, their statements needed for the official investigation. While they waited, Miss Marple engaged in what appeared to be idle conversation with several regatta attendees. From the harbour master, she learned that Geoffrey Ashford had arrived at dawn to begin preparing the Lady Margaret for the parade. From the boat club steward, she discovered that Thomas Wright had arrived much later, around 11 o'clock, claiming he had spent the morning at their business office. From a fellow steam launch owner, she heard that Wright and Ashford's partnership had seemed strained in recent months. Most intriguing was her conversation with Dr. Haydock, who had been summoned to certify death. "Died instantly, Miss Marple. The force of the explosion and the scalding steam would have left no time for suffering." Dr. Haydock paused, his expression troubled. "Though, I must say, I'm puzzled by the boiler failure itself. For all safety mechanisms to fail simultaneously suggests something more than simple mechanical breakdown." "What sort of something, Doctor?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Deliberate interference, I should think, though proving it will be another matter entirely. The explosion destroyed much of the evidence." Miss Marple's attention was caught by Thomas Wright's arrival at the boat club, accompanied by a constable. Wright looked haggard, his earlier blank expression replaced by something that might have been grief. He moved with careful deliberation, though Miss Marple noticed that his supposedly problematic back seemed to cause him no difficulty as he navigated the club steps. Inspector Craddock emerged to speak with Wright, and Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe without appearing to eavesdrop. Wright explained that he had originally been scheduled to pilot the Lady Margaret during the parade, while Ashford judged from shore, but had asked to switch places at the last moment due to a painful back spasm. Geoffrey was very understanding, Wright said, his voice catching slightly. He always was. Said his back was fine and he'd be happy to take the helm. I had no idea that offering to switch with him would save my life and cost him his. Miss Marple's keen ears caught the tremor in Wright's voice, but her keen eyes observed something that contradicted his narrative. Throughout their conversation, Wright had shifted his weight several times, moved his arms freely, and bent forward to retrieve a dropped handkerchief without any sign of discomfort. For someone supposedly suffering from a back spasm severe enough to prevent standing for an hour, his movements seemed remarkably unrestricted. After Wright departed, Miss Marple approached Inspector Craddock. "Inspector, might I inquire whether you've had opportunity to verify Mr. Wright's account of his back complaint?" "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Simply that one might confirm whether Mr. Wright sought medical attention for this back spasm, or mentioned it to anyone before his conversation with Mr. Ashford this afternoon. It seems the sort of detail that would be either documented or remembered by others." Inspector Craddock made a note. "I'll make inquiries, though I must say, Miss Marple, you seem to have developed suspicions about Mr. Wright rather quickly." "I'm an old woman, Inspector, and I've observed a great many people in my lifetime. One learns to recognize when someone's grief is genuine and when it's performed. Mr. Wright's distress seems rather too calculated." Chapter 4. Welding Skills and a Shipyard Past. The following morning brought Detective Sergeant Lake to Miss Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, carrying preliminary findings from the police investigation. Inspector Craddock had taken Miss Marple's observations seriously enough to pursue several lines of inquiry that were yielding troubling results. "The inspector thought you'd want to know, Miss Marple," Sergeant Lake began, accepting the cup of tea she offered. "We've been looking into Thomas Wright's background, and several interesting facts have emerged. Most notably, before he went into the marine restoration business with Geoffrey Ashford, Wright worked for 15 years in a shipyard as a certified welder." Miss Marple's expression showed no surprise, though her eyes brightened with interest. "How very intriguing, Sergeant. I don't suppose his welding qualifications extended to working with high-pressure vessels?" As a matter of fact, they did. Wright was specifically trained in boiler repair and pressure vessel fabrication. According to his former supervisor, he was considered one of their most skilled craftsmen. Sergeant Lake consulted his notebook. He left the shipyard 12 years ago when he and Ashford established their restoration business, but he's maintained his certification. "And would his skills enable him to seal a boiler's safety valve in such a way that the tampering might not be immediately visible?" Miss Marple inquired gently. The sergeant nodded grimly. "According to the marine engineers we've consulted, yes. A skilled welder could seal a safety valve so precisely that only close inspection would reveal the modification." "I don't suppose you've had opportunity to examine Mr. Wright's recent movements?" "That's where things become even more interesting. Wright has a key to the boat club's workshop facilities. Several club members recall seeing Wright working late in the workshop 3 evenings last week. He claimed he was repairing tools, but no one actually saw what he was doing." "The workshop has welding equipment, I presume?" "Complete welding setup, including the precise type of torch that could be used for the delicate work required to seal a safety valve." The sergeant paused. "But here's what's truly disturbing. We found Wright's work journal in the office he shared with Ashford. It contains detailed technical notes about various restoration projects, including extensive diagrams and calculations related to steam boiler operations." Miss Marple sat very still. "Dated entries, I presume?" "Going back 6 weeks, including several pages of notes about pressure calculations, safety valve specifications, and what Wright labelled as failure point analysis." Sergeant Lake's expression was grim. "One might argue these were legitimate technical studies, but the level of detail regarding catastrophic failure scenarios is rather suspicious." "Particularly if those notes were made in the weeks immediately preceding an actual catastrophic failure," Miss Marple added quietly. "We've also found no evidence that Wright sought medical attention for back pain. Moreover, several witnesses saw Wright on Saturday, the day before the explosion, moving heavy equipment at the boat club without any apparent difficulty. Heavy equipment. A steel workbench that 2 men usually shift together. Wright moved it by himself, hardly the action of someone with a debilitating back spasm the following day." Miss Marple considered these revelations carefully. So, Mr. Wright fabricated the back complaint to avoid piloting the Lady Margaret during the parade. This suggests he knew the vessel was dangerous. Yet, he allowed Mr. Ashford to board without warning him. You're saying Wright intended for Ashford to die. I'm saying that when Wright realized his plan had been disrupted, he had a choice. He could have warned Ashford, or he could remain silent. His silence suggests Geoffrey Ashford's death served Thomas Wright's purposes just as well. Chapter 5. Gambling Debts and a Partnership Agreement. By Tuesday afternoon, Inspector Craddock had uncovered information that transformed the investigation from suspicious circumstances to clear evidence of motive for murder. He arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a thick folder of financial documents and an expression that suggested genuine shock. "Miss Marple," he began, without preamble, "I've spent the last 24 hours examining the finances of Thomas Wright and Geoffrey Ashford, and what I've discovered is both enlightening and deeply disturbing." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gave the inspector her full attention. "I take it Mr. Wright's financial situation was not as stable as his professional partnership suggested. Thomas Wright is drowning in gambling debts. Over the past 18 months, he's accumulated liabilities of approximately £200,000, most of it owed to establishments that are less than reputable in their collection methods." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though a slight narrowing of her eyes suggested this information confirmed her suspicions. "And his ability to repay these debts from his share of the business income?" "Non-existent. Wright and Ashford's marine restoration business generates annual revenues around £100,000. After expenses and taxes, Wright's personal income was perhaps £20,000 per year. At that rate, it would take him 10 years to clear his debts, assuming he incurred no new gambling losses. Which means Mr. Wright needed access to much larger sums of money, and needed it urgently. I don't suppose the business had substantial reserves." Inspector Craddock shook his head. Their largest single asset was the Lady Margaret herself, valued at approximately £100,000 after restoration. But the vessel was owned jointly, requiring both partners' agreement for any sale. "Except in the event of one partner's death. I imagine their partnership agreement contained provisions for such circumstances." The inspector's expression grew grimmer. "It did indeed. The agreement states quite clearly that in the event of one partner's death, the surviving partner inherits the deceased partner's entire share of the business, including all assets. The business is worth approximately £500,000. Miss Marple absorbed this information quietly. So, if Geoffrey Ashford died, Thomas Wright would inherit enough to clear his gambling debts and leave him financially comfortable. Precisely, and here's where the timing becomes significant. Inspector Craddock produced another document. Wright's largest creditors had given him an ultimatum: full repayment by the end of July, or face consequences. The regatta took place on July 21st. Wright had 10 days remaining when the Lady Margaret exploded. The picture that was emerging was one of desperate calculation. Thomas Wright, trapped by debts he could never repay through legitimate means, had seen murder as his only financial salvation. "The truly chilling aspect," Miss Marple said quietly, "is that Mr. Wright must have believed he could make the murder appear to be an accident. If the tampering had gone undetected, Wright would have inherited everything, cleared his debts, and been free to continue his business." Inspector Craddock nodded. "And the regatta provided perfect timing and cover, a tragic accident during a risky historical boat operation witnessed by hundreds of people. If not for your observation about that forged inspection certificate, Miss Marple, we might never have looked beyond the obvious explanation. Which brings us to the certificate itself. Have your inquiries revealed anything about its origin?" The certificate bore the name of Arthur Pemberton, a certified marine engineer. When we contacted Mr. Pemberton, he confirmed he had never inspected the Lady Margaret. The document was a complete forgery. Chapter 6. The diary's detailed drawings and damning dates. Wednesday morning brought the breakthrough that would prove decisive. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with an evidence bag containing a leather-bound diary seized from Wright's office. The diary itself was unremarkable, a standard business journal, but its contents were anything but routine. "Miss Marple, I think you'll find this rather illuminating," Inspector Craddock said, carefully removing the diary and opening it to several marked pages. Wright kept meticulous records of his technical work, including detailed drawings and calculations that prove beyond doubt his intent to sabotage the Lady Margaret's boiler system. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the pages with careful attention. The drawings showed precise cross-sections of the Lady Margaret's boiler assembly, with particular focus on the safety valve mechanism. Wright had annotated the drawings with measurements, pressure calculations, and notes about welding techniques. The entries are dated beginning 6 weeks before the regatta, Inspector Craddock explained. They show a systematic study of how to cause a catastrophic boiler failure that would appear to be accidental. Wright even calculated the optimal pressure at which the modified safety valve would fail, ensuring the explosion would be both deadly and spectacular. How very methodical, Miss Marple observed quietly. One might almost admire the thoroughness if it weren't being applied to murder. The inspector turned to another page. Here's where it becomes truly damning. Wright made entries specifically referencing the Lady Margaret by name, along with calculations about when, during the parade, the boiler pressure would reach critical levels. He timed the sabotage to ensure the explosion would occur in full view of the crowd, maximizing the appearance of tragic accident. Miss Marple studied the precise handwriting, noting the calm, technical tone of the entries. There was no hint of emotional conflict or moral struggle, just clinical analysis of how to commit murder through mechanical failure. There's more, Inspector Craddock continued. Wright also documented his creation of the forged inspection certificate. He practiced Arthur Pemberton's signature multiple times on scratch paper before creating the final document. We found the practice sheets in his desk drawer, carelessly left behind because he never imagined anyone would search his office. The arrogance of thinking one has committed the perfect crime, Miss Marple murmured. It so often leads to precisely these sorts of oversights, the inspector nodded. We also recovered Wright's personal diary from his home. The entries there are quite different in tone from his technical journal. They show a man in increasing psychological distress as his gambling debts mounted and his creditors became more threatening. Several entries reference desperation and references to having no choice. Interesting that he should frame it as having no choice, Miss Marple observed. There were, of course, many choices available to him. Bankruptcy, selling personal assets, even confessing to his partner and seeking help. But he chose murder instead. The personal diary also contains several entries about the upcoming regatta and the best restored vessel competition. Wright wrote extensively about how the Lady Margaret's expected victory would increase the business's value, and how unfortunate it was that the partnership agreement required Ashford's consent for any major business decisions. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. So he was already thinking about the partnership agreement and its death provisions well before he began his technical planning. The gambling debts created the immediate crisis, but I suspect Wright had been contemplating this solution for some time. Inspector Craddock closed the diary carefully. We have enough evidence now to arrest Wright and charge him with first-degree murder. The diary entries establish premeditation, the technical drawings prove his method, and the forged certificate shows his attempt to cover his tracks. Combined with his welding skills and access to the Lady Margaret, we have a complete chain of evidence. And his motive is abundantly clear from the financial records, Miss Marple added. Though I confess I'm curious about one aspect. Did Mr. Wright make any preparations for how he would explain his sudden financial recovery after inheriting the business? Actually, yes. His personal diary includes notes about claiming he would use life insurance proceeds and business loans to restructure debts. He even researched which banks would be most likely to extend credit to him after Ashford's death. Chapter 7. The Confrontation and a Killer's Crumbling Defence. Thursday morning brought the moment Inspector Craddock had been carefully preparing. Thomas Wright was summoned to the police station for what he was told would be routine follow-up questioning about his late partner's affairs. Miss Marple, at the inspector's unusual request, was present in an adjacent room where she could observe the interview through a one-way mirror. The inspector felt her insights into human nature might prove valuable during the confrontation. Wright arrived looking haggard, his clothes rumpled and his face showing signs of sleepless nights. He settled into the interview room chair with the careful movements of someone under considerable strain, though he maintained an air of cooperative professionalism. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Wright," Inspector Craddock began cordially. "I know this must be a difficult time for you, dealing with the loss of your partner and friend of 20 years. "It's been devastating," Wright replied, his voice steady but flat. Geoffrey was more than a business partner. He was like a brother to me. I still can't quite believe he's gone." The inspector nodded sympathetically, then opened the folder before him. "I'd like to clarify a few details about the day of the regatta, if you don't mind. You mentioned that you were originally scheduled to pilot the Lady Margaret during the parade, but asked Mr. Ashford to switch places with you due to back pain." "That's correct. I'd been having terrible spasms all morning. Standing for an hour would have been impossible. Yet several witnesses have come forward who saw you moving heavy equipment at the boat club on Saturday, the day before the regatta. A steel workbench specifically that normally requires 2 men to lift. You managed it alone, apparently without difficulty." Wright's expression flickered briefly, but he recovered quickly. "The back problem came on suddenly Sunday morning. These things happen with age, Inspector." "Of course," Inspector Craddock agreed pleasantly. "Though it's curious that you didn't mention this sudden onset to anyone except Mr. Ashford. No one else at the regatta heard you complain of back pain before the conversation, where you asked him to switch places with you." "I don't like to make a fuss about such things," Wright replied, a note of defensiveness entering his voice. The inspector let the subject drop and moved to another topic. "I understand you worked as a certified welder before establishing your restoration business with Mr. Ashford. Specialized in high-pressure vessel repair, correct?" "Yes, that's right. My shipyard experience was invaluable in our restoration work." "I'm sure it was. Tell me, Mr. Wright, do you still maintain your welding certification?" "I renew it every 3 years. It's required for some of our projects." Wright's eyes had grown wary, clearly sensing the direction of the questioning. Inspector Craddock produced several photographs from his folder. "These are images of the Lady Margaret's boiler safety valve, recovered from the wreckage by police divers. Marine engineers have examined it and found something quite interesting. The valve had been deliberately welded shut in a manner that required considerable skill and precision. The kind of skill you possess, in fact." Wright's face went pale. "I had nothing to do with that. Why would I sabotage Geoffrey's vessel? It was as much mine as his." "That's an excellent question," the inspector agreed. "Let me show you something else." He produced Wright's technical journal, opening it to the pages containing the boiler diagrams. "This is your handwriting, I believe. Your work journal, found in your office." Wright stared at the pages, his composure visibly cracking. "Those are just technical studies. I was learning about steam boiler systems for our restoration work." "Really? Then perhaps you can explain why these particular studies focus so extensively on catastrophic failure scenarios, and why they include specific references to the Lady Margaret, complete with calculations about when during the parade the boiler pressure would reach critical levels." I was concerned about safety. I wanted to understand the risks." Inspector Craddock's expression hardened. "Mr. Wright, we've also examined your financial records. You're carrying gambling debts of approximately £200,000. Your creditors had given you an ultimatum for full repayment by the end of July. That's rather significant pressure, wouldn't you say?" Wright said nothing, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "We've obtained a copy of your partnership agreement with Mr. Ashford," the inspector continued relentlessly. "The one that states the surviving partner inherits everything in the event of the other's death. The business is worth £500,000, more than enough to clear your debts and leave you comfortable." "This is ridiculous," Wright said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're suggesting I killed Geoffrey for money." Chapter 8. The Forged Certificate and a Failed Gamble. Inspector Craddock leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas Wright with the patient intensity of a man who held all the cards and knew it. The accused man's initial defiance was crumbling, replaced by a growing awareness that his carefully constructed facade was collapsing around him. "Let's discuss the safety inspection certificate," the inspector said, producing a photograph of the document Wright had displayed so prominently at the regatta. This certificate, allegedly signed by Arthur Pemberton, certified the Lady Margaret's boiler as safe just 1 week before it exploded. Rather unfortunate timing, wouldn't you say? Wright's eyes fixed on the photograph, his expression trapped between denial and resignation. "Geoffrey handled all the inspection paperwork. I never saw that certificate until he put it on display." "That's interesting, because Mr. Pemberton tells a different story. He confirms he never inspected the Lady Margaret at all. Someone forged his signature on a completely fabricated document." Inspector Craddock pulled out another page. "We found these in your desk drawer, Mr. Wright. Practice sheets where you copied Mr. Pemberton's signature multiple times, perfecting your forgery. The evidence was damning. Sheets of paper covered with repeated attempts at replicating Pemberton's distinctive signature. Wright stared at them, his face ashen, realizing the trap closing around him. The forgery served two purposes, the inspector continued. First, it prevented any legitimate inspector from examining the boiler and discovering your sabotage. Second, it provided documentation you could point to after the explosion, claiming all proper safety procedures had been followed. Rather clever, really, except you underestimated the attention to detail of a certain elderly lady who happened to notice the signature looked hesitant. "This is circumstantial," Wright managed weakly. "None of this proves I actually did anything to the boiler." Inspector Craddock's expression suggested he had been waiting for precisely this objection. "Actually, Mr. Wright, we have considerably more than circumstantial evidence. We have your personal diary, recovered from your home. Would you like me to read some of the entries?" Wright closed his eyes, as if by not seeing the evidence he could make it cease to exist. The inspector opened the diary to marked pages and began reading aloud. "March 15th. The debts are becoming impossible. Malone's people made it clear what happens if I don't pay by July 31st. I see no way out unless something changes dramatically." The inspector looked up. "That's 3 months before the regatta, Mr. Wright. Shall I continue?" When Wright didn't respond, Inspector Craddock turned to another page. "April 22nd. Studied the partnership agreement again today. The death clause is straightforward. If Jeffrey were to die, I would inherit his share. The business is worth at least $500,000. It would solve everything." Wright's head dropped, his hands trembling in his lap. The inspector continued, his voice steady and implacable. "May 10th. Began researching steam boiler mechanics in detail. The safety valve is the key. If it were to fail under pressure, the explosion would be catastrophic. No one would question a tragic accident with these old vessels." Inspector Craddock closed the diary. "Would you like me to read more, or have you heard enough?" "I never meant for it to happen like that," Wright whispered, his defences finally collapsing completely. "It wasn't supposed to be Jeffrey. I was supposed to be on that boat." The inspector leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "Explain what you mean." Wright's story came out in broken fragments, a confession driven by the impossibility of maintaining his lies any longer. He had indeed sabotaged the boiler, had indeed planned his own death to look like an accident. The insurance payout combined with the business inheritance would have cleared his debts and left his estranged daughter financially secure. It was to be a suicide disguised as accident, sparing his family the shame and insurance complications of an obvious self-inflicted death. "But then your back suddenly developed problems," Inspector Craddock observed dryly. "I lost my nerve," Wright admitted. "When the moment came, I couldn't do it. I invented the back problem so Jeffrey would pilot the boat instead. I told myself I'd warn him, that I'd claim I'd discovered something wrong with the boiler at the last minute. But when it came time to speak, I stayed silent." Miss Marple, observing from the adjacent room, felt a chill at these words. Wright hadn't merely committed murder, he had chosen murder over his original plan of suicide. When self-destruction proved too difficult, he had sacrificed his friend instead. Chapter 9. The Truth About Friendship and 20 Years of Trust. The full confession took another hour, with Wright providing details about how he had carried out the sabotage. He had worked late in the boat club workshop on 3 separate evenings, using his welding skills to seal the Lady Margaret's safety valve so precisely that the modification was invisible to casual inspection. He had calculated the optimal pressure for catastrophic failure, ensuring the explosion would be dramatic enough to preclude any suggestion of mechanical negligence. "I knew Jeffrey's habits," Wright said, his voice hollow with self-loathing. "I knew he'd fire up the boiler early to ensure optimal pressure for the parade. I knew exactly when the failure would occur, right at the moment he engaged the throttle. It was meant to be instant, no suffering." Inspector Craddock's expression showed no sympathy. "You're saying you killed your friend of 20 years as an act of mercy." "I'm saying I was desperate and I made a terrible choice." Wright looked up, his eyes red but dry. "The gambling debts consumed everything. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Malone's people made it clear what would happen if I didn't pay. They threatened my daughter, Inspector. They said they knew where she worked, where she lived. So you chose to sacrifice Geoffrey Ashford instead, the inspector replied coldly. Wright's face crumpled. He knew. Geoffrey knew I was in trouble, even though I never told him the details. He kept offering to help, kept saying we were partners, and that meant facing problems together. But I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't admit I'd lost hundreds of thousands gambling. Pride, Inspector Craddock observed. You let pride prevent you from accepting help, and then you let it drive you to murder. Wright described forging the inspection certificate, practicing Pemberton's signature until he could replicate it convincingly. He had created the false document using official-looking paper stock, complete with a forged certification stamp made from a carved rubber block. I thought if I could just get through the regatta, if the explosion could look completely accidental, no one would question it. Boiler failures happen with these old vessels. Wright's voice carried bitter irony. I'd read about similar accidents. I knew the investigation would focus on mechanical failure, not sabotage. Except you didn't account for Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock said. She noticed the forged signature. She recognized that boiler explosions in certified vessels are extraordinarily rare, and she questioned your convenient back problem. Your perfect crime unraveled because an observant elderly lady paid attention to details you thought were too small to matter. Wright actually laughed, a sound devoid of humor. An old woman with sharp eyes. That's what brought me down. From her observation post, Miss Marple reflected on this common criminal failing. Murderers so often focused on the grand scheme while overlooking small details that ultimately exposed them. Wright had planned meticulously how to sabotage the boiler, but had carelessly left practice signatures in his desk and written detailed confessions in his diary. There's one aspect I still don't understand, Inspector Craddock said. When you invented the back problem and convinced Geoffrey to pilot the boat instead, you could have warned him. You could have claimed you'd discovered something wrong with the boiler. Instead, you let him board that vessel knowing it would explode. Why? Wright was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because I realized that Geoffrey's death solved my problems just as well as my own death would have. Better, actually, because I'd be alive to inherit the business and pay off the debts. In that moment, when he agreed to switch places with me, I saw a way out that didn't require my own death. The admission hung in the air, more damning than any evidence could be. Wright had chosen his own survival over his friend's life, had calculated in that brief moment that murder was preferable to suicide. Chapter 10. Justice Served and the Cost of Desperate Choices. The trial of Thomas Wright took place in late September, after 3 months of investigation and legal proceedings. Miss Marple attended as a witness, her testimony about the forged signature and Wright's suspicious behaviour proving crucial to the prosecution's case. The evidence was overwhelming, Wright's diary entries and technical drawings establishing premeditation beyond any doubt. Wright's defence attempted to argue diminished capacity due to psychological pressure from the gambling debts and threats from his creditors. Expert witnesses testified about the effects of extreme stress on decision-making and judgment, but the prosecution countered effectively, pointing to the methodical planning evident in Wright's diary and the calculated nature of his actions at the regatta. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder. Wright showed no emotion as the verdict was read, sitting in the dock with the same blank expression Miss Marple had observed at the regatta when the Lady Margaret exploded. At sentencing, the judge spoke at length about the betrayal of trust that made Wright's crime particularly heinous. You murdered a man who considered you a brother, who had offered repeatedly to help you with your financial difficulties. You betrayed 20 years of friendship and partnership for money. The court can find no mitigating circumstances that justify such calculated cruelty. Wright was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. As he was led from the courtroom, he glanced once toward where Miss Marple sat in the gallery. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his expression not defiance or anger, but a profound emptiness. Afterward, Inspector Craddock joined Miss Marple for tea at her cottage in St. Mary Mead. The case had affected him more than most, the cold calculation of Wright's actions contrasting sharply with the supposed friendship that had existed between the two men. "I've investigated many murders," the inspector said, "but there's something particularly disturbing about this one. Wright had alternatives available. He could have declared bankruptcy, could have accepted Ashford's offers of help, could have gone to the police about the threats from his creditors. Instead, he chose murder." Miss Marple poured tea thoughtfully. "Addiction does terrible things to people's judgment, Inspector. Mr. Wright's gambling had progressed beyond mere recreation to a compulsion he couldn't control. The debts were symptoms of a deeper problem." "That doesn't excuse murder. No, indeed it doesn't. But it helps us understand how a seemingly rational man could convince himself that killing his friend was the only solution to his problems." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "The tragedy is that Mr. Wright destroyed 2 lives that day, Mr. Ashford's through death and his own through the choice to commit murder." Inspector Craddock nodded slowly. Ashford's daughter testified at the trial. She spoke about how her father had mentioned being worried about Wright, about wanting to help him but not knowing how. Ashford apparently suspected gambling problems and had even researched addiction counselling services. How very sad. Mr. Ashford was trying to help, and Mr. Wright was planning to kill him. Miss Marple gazed out her window, at the peaceful garden beyond. "One sees it time and again in village life, Inspector. People carrying burdens they believe are too shameful to share, refusing help because of pride, making terrible choices because they feel trapped." "The boat club has established a memorial fund in Ashford's name," the inspector mentioned. "They're using it to provide free boiler inspections for owners of vintage steam launches, ensuring no one else dies from mechanical failure." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "How appropriate. Mr. Ashford's dedication to maritime safety will continue even after his death." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, before the inspector spoke again. "Miss Marple, may I ask how you knew to look so carefully at that inspection certificate? What made you suspicious?" "Experience, I suppose, Inspector. I've observed human nature for many years, and I've learned that when something appears too perfect, it often isn't genuine. The certificate was displayed too prominently as though someone wanted to ensure it was noticed. And the signature, as I mentioned, had that careful quality one sees in forgery rather than the natural flow of someone signing their own name. And Wright's behaviour at the Regatta. That was simpler. Genuine shock and grief have a certain quality that can't be feigned convincingly. Mr. Wright's reaction was too controlled, too focused on establishing his own innocence. A truly devastated partner would have been less articulate, less concerned with explaining how he came to be safe while his friend died." Inspector Craddock finished his tea and stood to leave. "The case is closed, but I suspect the questions it raises will remain with me. How well do we really know the people we trust? What drives seemingly normal people to commit murder? When does financial pressure cross the line from motivation to excuse?" Miss Marple walked with him to the door. "Those are questions worth pondering, Inspector. Though I would suggest that Mr. Wright's case teaches us something important. He believed his problems were unsolvable, that he had no choice but murder. In reality, he had many choices. He simply lacked the courage to make the difficult ones that would have required admitting weakness and accepting help." As the inspector departed, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room and picked up her knitting. The case of the Lady Margaret and Thomas Wright would remain in her memory as an example of how pride and addiction could corrupt friendship and lead to tragedy. Geoffrey Ashford had died, not because of mechanical failure, but because his partner and friend had valued money over loyalty, survival over honour, and his own life over 20 years of trust. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting peaceful shadows across Miss Marple's cottage. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued its quiet existence, a village where people generally knew their neighbours and looked after one another. But Miss Marple understood, as she had always understood, that beneath the surface of even the most peaceful communities ran currents of human weakness, desperation, and sometimes, tragically, the capacity for terrible choices. The end.